Well, thank you. Thank you for Suzanne for organizing and inviting me. Thank you, everyone else who was part of the organization of this conference, and for everyone being here. I'm actually very honored to be here talking to you. For someone who has felt silenced in this debate for a long time, it is really nice to have an audience. So I also want to thank, before I begin, the members of Green Oceans. We have a board of trustees that have been unbelievably productive in the last year, an entire executive committee that has been tireless. But most of all, I want to thank my co-founder, Bill Thompson, who's here in the room. I want to thank him for his courage, his leadership, and his wisdom. I also want to emphasize, despite the rumors, especially in the Cape Cod Times recently, that we are not funded by the fossil fuel companies, nor do we have any connections with the Koch brothers. We are a completely nonpartisan grassroots organization. We share a concern for our environment and for the climate, and we particularly share a love for the ocean. So our mission, Green Ocean's mission, is to protect the ocean and biodiversity because that ensures our own survival. A healthy ocean is one of our best defenses against climate change. Why? Well, the ocean, as many of you know, produces more oxygen for our planet than all of the rainforests in the world. It absorbs carbon dioxide and the excess heat we produce. Like the circulatory system in the body, the ocean is absolutely vital to the health of the planet. So, what are we doing by industrializing the ocean? Most of you might know, but there are plans off our shores to put over 1,000 wind turbines, each of them over 870 feet tall, only 12.9 miles from the coast. And these are driven by state mandates, not by science. So this is a map where these 1,000 turbines are going to go. It consists of 9 projects. These 9 projects will cover over 1,400 square miles of pristine ocean. That's more than the state of Rhode Island itself. These are going to be the largest turbines ever built, the greatest number in one location anywhere on Earth, and the largest marine construction project in the history of the world. Even China hasn't tried to do something like this. So those of you who might actually be for offshore wind might be thinking, well, more is actually better and bigger is better. This means that this country has finally gotten serious about climate change and we're finally doing something about it. But as the Washington Post actually published 7 years ago, bigger is not always better. The more renewables you have, the bigger the problem can be. And that problem is that they rely on natural gas. They rely on fossil fuels. So how big is big? Well, these are very big. 870 feet compared to the lighthouse off of the Seconic Point. The lighthouse is 70 feet tall. This is how it looks from shore, and this is how it looks compared to one of the typical turbines that are going to be off our shores. They're bigger than any building in all of Boston. They are going to be enormous. And why is big? Why does it matter? Well, it turns out that bigger turbines use bigger foundations. Those foundations have to be jackhammered, basically, or pile driven 300 feet into the ocean bed, into the seafloor, in order to stand up. Bigger also means that they're going to be more vulnerable to hurricanes, to strong winds, and they're going to be more likely to fail. So, what else goes with big? Big oil. Well, big oil is big wind. And one of the things that Nicholas Krakow, or whatever his name is, actually did not know is that big oil is driving this. So the Danish oil and natural gas company is now Ørsted. They've changed their name, but they haven't changed their spots. Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, is now Equinor. British Petroleum just bought the Beacon Hill lease, and Avangrid is the big Spanish energy giant. And finally, we have Shell Oil. So can we trust big oil now that they want to be big wind? Well, I would say, as a physician, they are not actually adhering to the Hippocratic Oath. We have a sick planet, and they are not adhering to the do no harm oath. They know they're going to be doing harm. What kind of harm and to what extent? Oddly enough, some people, even people who agree that we need offshore wind, would say that there are places in the ocean where it might not be appropriate. Well, one of those places is a place called Cox's Ledge. So this is a depth map of the ocean. And you can see from the turquoise that though there's an area that's a little bit lighter and a little more shallow. This area happens to be a foraging ground for 5 endangered whale species and one of the last remaining spawning grounds for southern New England cod. And yet, despite that, BOEM and our US government went ahead and approved the 2 projects that are going to cover the entire area of Cox's Ledge. So that circled area is the same area, and you can see it's now covered with where turbines are going to be placed and inter-array cables are going to be connecting. Why does this matter? Well, biodiversity does matter in terms of our health. The World Health Organization said that biodiversity is more important for human survival than climate change. NOAA was worried. They wrote 2 separate letters to BOEM saying these projects are going to pose population-level risks to southern New England cod. And yet, BOEM went ahead and approved those projects anyway. And not only that, they approved it despite the fact that the company admitted that there is going to have an overall cumulative adverse, a major adverse impact of all commercial fishing and recreational fishing. So you might ask, why are the companies actually admitting these kinds of things? Well, it turns out that the impact statements are kind of like a confessional report. If the companies confess to all of these adverse impacts, then when the government goes ahead and approves the project, it's not the company's fault. We told you it might have population level impacts on cod, but you approved it anyway, so it's not our fault and we can't be sued. Well, turns out there are some problems with marine mammals as well. Are they worried about all the marine mammals that like to forage during the winter on Cox's Ledge? Are they worried about all the marine mammals that migrate through all of the Atlantic continental shelf areas where all of the wind projects are planned from North Carolina up to Maine? Well, they probably are, and they probably should be, because 78 large whales have died in the past year during offshore wind construction and site survey work. Well, a lot of people would say, including the government and also the Conservation Law Fund, that there is absolutely no connection or any reason to be worried about these things. Even when a whale dies right in the middle of the South Fork Wind construction site, we can tell this because of the number on the foundation. So this is a pile-driven foundation, and this is a dead whale right in front of it. It's a humpback whale. Well, when the Conservation Law Fund actually comes out and says that there's absolutely no connection, and NOAA comes out and says there's no connection, you have to wonder why. In the Conservation Law Fund's instance, I actually give them a pass. Well, not complete pass, but I actually respect their work. I think they are smart people. I just don't think they've done their homework. They have not looked to see that on the NOAA site, you can download the incidental Harassment authorization form. It turns out it's illegal to actually harm or harass whales, any marine mammal, unless you ask permission first. If you ask permission, you can actually harm and even kill a whale. Well, it turns out that the South Fork Wind Company, or actually Ørsted, asked permission. They not only asked permission, but they specifically asked permission to harm humpback whales, the very type of whale that was dead in the South Fork area. Not only did they ask for the humpback whales, but they asked for more humpback whales than any other kind of whale. So they must have known that this particular whale was actually vulnerable. Level A harassment is the type of harassment that leads to permanent injury and even death. So why are they trying to tell us that there may not be any connection between the whale death and the construction site? The company asked for permission and the government gave them permission. Why would they ask and why would they be given permission if there was absolutely no connection between the two things? Well, I think the Conservation Law Fund had to close its eyes to this, and I'm not sure why. I think probably because they really truly believe that offshore wind is the answer to our climate problem, and therefore they don't want anybody like you or me to thwart them in any way. Well, they're going to have to close their eyes to a lot more, because just for the projects off the coast of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they've given permission for over 13,000 whale harassments, 250,000 dolphin and porpoises, and 73,000 seals. That's a lot of marine mammal permissions to be asking for, and it's a lot to be giving too. So what about the birds? Well, it turns out that you don't have to ask for the same kind of permissions for birds, so we don't know exactly, but we do know that raptors and eagles are particularly vulnerable to these kinds of things because they're never expecting the turbine blades to be coming from above. We also know that there are at least 4 endangered species in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that are going to be flying through these areas. One in particular is a beloved bird called the piping plover, and here is a map of the actual migratory pathway. Well, some people say that birds, so there's a little, collateral damage here. Well, how do you feel about the fact that maybe that collateral damage is also for humans? So it turns out that offshore turbines disrupt radar. That means that the Coast Guard has admitted that they will have to abort search and rescue during bad weather. Well, how often do you have a situation where you need to be rescuing someone in good weather? It's usually bad weather. And so they have admitted that these turbine farms, 1,400 square miles of them, are going to be prohibited from doing search and rescue during bad weather in those farms. That means there's going to be an unavoidable or a loss of life that would otherwise have been avoidable. And that is in their statement when they talk about the offshore wind turbines. So that's a lot of bad news. Well, what else could the offshore developers be hiding from us? Well, it turns out quite a bit. So this is a picture of 2 different simulations. It turns out this is from the Ørsted Revolution Wind Farm. They have 2 separate sets. One they submit to the government and the other they give to the public. And this is a blow up of the actual simulation. And I've blown it up not to show how bad the view is, but just to demonstrate that the top one, which is the private one that they submitted to the government, you can actually see turbines on the horizon. The public one that they actually let the public view, you can see no turbines. So no wonder people think, oh, what are people upset about? You're not going to be able to see them. Well, you will be able to see them from at least 40 miles away. What else has the company and the government actually kept from us? Well, they've kept the emergency response plan to oil spills. It turns out there's a lot of diesel oil, lubricants, and other things in these turbines. They've kept the safety management confidential. They've kept the air emissions calculations and methodology confidential, the impact to historical resources, and finally, the economic effects of these wind farms. So this is in public property. The ocean, it does belong to the public, and US citizens are paying 70% of the construction costs. These companies, now that you know are fossil fuel companies, you know they're for-profit companies. So we're paying all this for for-profit companies, and they're not letting us see what the economic impacts are to our own states. But I have more bad news. One is the jet plowing for the cables. So it turns out to trench the cables, you have to liquefy the ocean bed 4 to 6 feet down to lay the cables. There are hundreds of miles of cables out there. This is going to create sediment plumes that not only will change spawning grounds and breeding grounds, it will suffocate the fish around them, and it will resuspend all of the toxic chemicals that have been in these areas for generations, if not centuries. So, and the government has never asked these companies to test in their course, any core samples along these routes for PFOAs, the forever chemicals, nor have they asked them to test for heavy metals, for BPAs, pesticides, any of the things that we might not want to be resuspended in the ocean, because once they're resuspended in the ocean, they get absorbed into the food chain and they are bioaccumulated and bioconcentrated in the fish that we love to eat. So if they can't actually liquefy the ocean bed and bury them with the jet plows, they use mattresses to cover up the cables. These mattresses will also change the habitat. But what's more worrisome to me is the fact that, this is a slightly more close up, is the fact that these are crisscrossed over 1,400 miles. These cables, especially the interarray cables, heat up. They emit heat. So 2 feet away will be increased by 36 degrees. That's a lot. Down in Florida, a 1 to 2 degree change in temperature bleached out 90% of the coral. We don't have coral reefs, but we have a lot of important things in our ocean, including fish eggs, plankton, small crustaceans, and a 36-degree increase might actually change some things. The export cables don't give off as much heat, but they give off something called electromagnetic fields, EMFs. So EMFs are very important for primitive species, especially things like squid, lobster, turtles. They use EMFs to migrate, and they also use EMFs to find food, avoid prey, and even to mate. So a study up in Scotland tried to see if it changed development in lobster in particular, and found that it actually caused eye malformations and tail malformations. And those tail malformations didn't allow the small lobster to swim properly. And so the scientists who ran this study predicted that these EMFs at the level of an export cable will have population level impacts on lobster. And we know now that population level is just another sort of euphemism for extinction. Then we have the substations, and maybe somebody else is talking about the substations, but one of the things that I wanted to mention about the substations is that we're going to have about 10 to 15 of them out there, maybe more. Each one sucks in 8 to 10 million gallons of ocean water a day, heats it up to 90 degrees, puts chlorine bleach in it, and then spews it back out. Everything that gets sucked in gets killed. Every plankton, every larva, every small little crustacean gets killed in this process. That's a lot of ocean water to be heating up and killing every single day. So how are these things actually getting accepted by the communities? One, I think that, people who already believe that this is going to be good for the climate are not bothering to read those environmental impact statements. The other thing is that there is government-sanctioned bribery, part of the lease process actually included asking the developers to put in a certain amount of money that they're going to actually give to communities to sort of soften or mitigate the impacts. So these community bribes have helped people accept the bad impact. But I don't know what $170 million is going to do for my grandchildren when when there's no fish left in New England. I mean, I know that's an exaggeration, but $170 million is a lot of money. It also shows that these are for-profit companies. They're not giving away $170 million unless it still makes financial sense. So what's happening that it still makes financial sense even though they're giving $170 million away? Well, we might say, okay, I can accept all these negative things if I knew it was actually going to help the planet. But it turns out that offshore wind is not so clean. If you just take into account the footprint of the manufacturing and the installation, it's pretty devastating. We have steel and cement, all made in China, shipped over in diesel ships to Europe where it's manufactured, and then shipped to the US where we have to install it. We have all of the rare earth metals, the cobalt and the copper, which is mined, a lot of it is mined in Africa and in China under not so great conditions. We know these countries have human rights abuses, and then it all has to be shipped to Europe and then to the United States. So the footprint alone is not very carbon friendly. But then you add on top of the fact that it is an intermittent source of energy or electricity. And every sailor knows that sometimes the wind doesn't blow. When the wind doesn't blow, we still want to be able to have our laptops working. And so that is why the Washington Post actually had the article about the fact that the more you have on the grid, the worse it is, because the more you have to have as your backup source. And it's not really a backup source. You have to have 100% of the electricity has to be able to be immediately added to the grid when the wind stops. When the wind stops for revolution wind, it's also going to be stopping for beacon wind. So it's not like one of the projects is going to be able to compensate for the other one. We have developed really efficient fossil fuel turbine generators. So, and I'm not advocating for these, but natural gas turbine generators, they're called cogen plants. They can generally operate at about a 70% efficiency. But when you actually have them on standby, and they have to go from a low level to a high level, cycling up and down, they go down to about a 35% efficiency, even less than that too sometimes. So you're going to be using more natural gas for less electricity. The other thing is most of the electricity that is generated by wind farms happens at night in the wintertime. Well, we use most of our electricity in the summer during the day, and we don't have batteries. We don't have the battery capability to store that electricity. And the interesting thing about batteries is we have not developed the technology that would allow us to store this and we will not have the battery power in our lifetime, if even for the next century. So I might be saying something very different about offshore wind if we had the battery backups. I don't really think so, but I might be. But we don't have the backup battery. So why are we doing this now instead of investing in the technology that would allow us to actually use the offshore wind? We could be investing in the battery technology. That's why the more we put on the grid, the worse the problem is going to be. And that is borne out in real life studies. Why are carbon emissions up despite the fact that we have so many renewables? Well, it's not really that much of a mystery. It's because of this intermittency. And the government knows that. They even say that they anticipate that the proposed action, and this is in the Revolution Wind environmental impact statement, will have no measurable influence on climate change. The company itself, in their fact sheet, They never mention that it's going to have any effect on carbon dioxide. They never mention that it's going to wean us off fossil fuels. They never mention that it's going to help climate change. The only thing they mention is that it's going to help us meet our state mandates. Well, you might think, okay, well, that's just one project. But even collectively, the government admits that there's going to be no collective impact on global warming. So if we're not getting a benefit from global warming, we have these known harms, maybe it's going to help the economy. Maybe that's why we're doing it. Well, the government also admits that offshore wind is the most expensive form of electricity out there, more expensive than nuclear. And who gets hurt when electricity rates not just double, but maybe quadruple? It's going to be the people who can afford it the least. Will it help the economy overall? Well, we know when electricity rates go up, usually manufacturing leaves. So that means that manufacturing is going to leave New England, maybe go to the south, but also maybe go to China. China is building a new coal-fired power plant once a week. By the end of this year, they're going to have built more coal-powered plants in 1 year than the United States has in the entire country. So the government also says that it's going to have a major adverse impact on employment. Some jobs will benefit, true, but overall, it's going to be a major negative adverse impact, and it's going to have a major adverse impact on the economy overall. And I haven't even mentioned decommissioning. So that's a whole nother subject. And decommissioning is a problem because the government has decided in its wisdom to not force or not make the companies who are developing these put aside adequate bonds to pay for decommissioning. We know that these companies, Shell Oil, all of these oil companies, they're not hanging on to these projects. They're building them. They're getting the tax breaks. Then they're turning them into limited liability companies. That means they have no financial or legal liability once these things are in the ground and are starting to make electricity. That means a hurricane could come by in a year and destroy it, and we would have no money to pay for these. What's more is that what we have learned from the project in Oklahoma that was decommissioned is decommissioning costs are actually higher than installation costs, sometimes significantly. But even if that's not true, the installation costs are much higher than we originally expected. So South Fork Wind, it turns out that each turbine cost $150 million. If we have 1,000 turbines out there, that's $150 billion that we're spending on something that we don't even know is going to help and probably will do far more harm than good. And the cost is astronomical, not only to build, but to get rid of. And if you think this technology isn't really up to snuff right now, it's only going to last 20 years. And at that point, it's very much going to be obsolete. So who's going to pay $150 billion to get rid of this? I don't think the ratepayers are going to want to. So I have to say that, again, I speak to this as a doctor. We need to know the benefits as well as the harms. When we had the COVID pandemic, the entire global economy was paralyzed, and yet the FDA required the vaccine companies actually do placebo-controlled trials to prove that their product made a benefit, helped prevent COVID. They also made them identify all the side effects. Why are we giving these companies such a pass? Why is the government just letting this happen? And I would argue that the COVID pandemic was just as much of a crisis as this climate crisis. And I would say that during the time of a crisis, and I think everybody who's a sailor or who's done anything that's kind of stressful, it's during a crisis you want to actually follow the rules. That's not when you want to start cutting corners. So We need to adopt solutions that will work, not just ones that we want to work. I think everybody wants offshore wind to work, but we have no evidence that it will. And the other thing I would like to say is we cannot afford to make a mistake now. If we actually do believe that we have a narrow window to try to solve the climate crisis, we do not need to be doing something with such a heavy carbon footprint now, and one that we don't have any assurance is going to actually work. So Green Oceans has taken the government to task for this, and we filed a lawsuit last week asking the government to follow its own rules. If this is a time of crisis, we need them to do this right. And we want to leave you with the idea that if we join together, we actually can try to get our voices heard. I'm not sure exactly why it's been so hard to have people listen to us, but I think the more we work together, the more people will have to start to listen. And Margaret Mead has a famous quote that I love, which is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And this is our slogan, "Keep it wild." And if anyone would like a yard sign, we can deliver them to you. Thank you.